In the glittering city of Marigold, Vincent Laclais was the king in business. From the top of his 60-story office tower, he could see all of downtown sprawling out beneath him, the streets filled with the people he ruled over, business partners, employees, competitors, and admirers. Vincent was a name synonymous with luxury and success. He had it all: wealth, power, influence, and respect, though respect was often tinged with a wary admiration, for Vincent was not the type of man one would easily like. Vincent's story began modesty enough. Born to a family of factory workers on the outskirts of Marigold, he grew up in a cramped apartment where he often went to bed hungry and wore patched clothes to school. This early deprivation planted in him a fierce drive to rise above his station and amass the kind of wealth that would insulate him from life's hardships. Determined to make it big, he studied relentlessly, worked odd jobs, and was the first in his family to go to college, where he studied business and finance. Those who knew him in those early years remembered him as intense and unyielding, with a spark of ambition that outshone everything else. Vincent's breakthrough came in his early 30s when he invested in a struggling fashion brand and transformed it into a global powerhouse. Leveraging his keen eye for trends and his ruthless approach to business, he built his empire, one high-stakes deal at a time. He surrounded himself with luxury, buying mansions, yachts, and rare art. With his fortune, he acquired exclusive properties around the world, including a private villa in the Mediterranean and a penthouse in Manhattan. The people of Marigold saw him as a figure larger than life, almost mythic, and Vincent reveled in it. But despite his impressive achievements, there was a side of Vincent that the public didn't see. While he paraded his wealth around Marigold, he was notoriously harsh on his employees and intolerant of mistakes. His staff feared him, knowing he wouldn't hesitate to fire anyone who fell short of his expectations. Rumors circulated of meetings where Vincent berated employees for hours, using their shortcomings as examples to instill fear and obedience. His companies suffered from high turnover rates, and Vincent took it as a sign that he was a tough but effective leader. One of his most notorious habits was his disdainful treatment of people he deemed unimportant. When passing through Marigold streets, he wouldn't spare a glance at street vendors, janitors, or even the employees at his own establishments. To him, they were all background players in his story of success, and he thought nothing of flaunting his wealth in their faces. Vincent would drive through Marigold in a gleaming, custom-made, gold-plated limousine, a spectacle that always brought traffic to a standstill. He loved the attention, the envy, and the knowledge that he was seen as the epitome of success. As Vincent's wealth and power grew, so did his enemies. Old business partners he'd undercut, competitors he'd crushed, and ex-employees he'd mistreated, all watched from the shadows, waiting for a crack in his armor. Yet Vincent remained arrogant, certain that his empire was untouchable. Then came the opportunity Vincent had been waiting for. A revolutionary tech startup pitched to him by a young developer. The startup, called Horizons, promised to redefine personal computing with an untested technology that could create fully immersive virtual experiences. The technology was still in its infancy, and many investors were hesitant to back it. But Vincent, always looking for the next big thing, saw it as his golden ticket to a legacy beyond just fashion and real estate. Ignoring the warnings from his advisors, he invested nearly half of his wealth into horizons, pouring millions into what he believed would be his crowning achievement. For a time, the gamble seemed to pay off. Horizons created a wave of excitement across the tech world, and the media hailed Vincent as a visionary. He boasted about his investment at every opportunity, throwing lavish parties and inviting celebrities, influencers, and the wealthiest elites to celebrate his latest triumph. But Vincent's pride and reckless spending blinded him to the cracks in Horizon's foundation. The technology had fundamental flaws that the developers couldn't fix, and soon, the truth began to unravel. Early tests revealed glitches that made the technology unreliable, and reports of malfunctions started to leak. Investors panicked, and the stock plummeted. Horizon's value, once sky high, was now crumbling, taking Vincent's fortune with it. In a matter of months, his empire began to collapse. Real estate investments that had once been his safety net were seized by creditors. Business partners distanced themselves, eager to avoid being dragged down with him. Desperate, Vincent tried to sell off his assets at a fraction of their value, but the vultures of the business world pounced, buying them up at cut-rate prices. His once loyal employees, whom he had always treated as disposable, showed no sympathy as they walked away from his imploding empire. One by one, Vincent's assets vanished. His mansion, his penthouse, even his gold-plated limousine were repossessed. He found himself with nothing, no allies, and nowhere to turn. His pride had left him isolated, and he was too ashamed to ask anyone for help. When he was finally forced out of his last property, Vincent found himself on the streets of Marigold, the city he had once ruled over. Now, he was just another face in the crowd, ignored by the very people he used to ignore. At first, Vincent tried to maintain some dignity, wandering the city in the hopes that someone might recognize him and offer help. But time passed, and he realized that people either didn't recognize him or didn't care. Slowly, hunger and exhaustion took their toll, and Vincent's pride gave way to desperation. With no money and no options, he turned to begging on the streets. Vincent's descent was complete. The same streets where he had once flaunted his wealth became his daily route as he walked from corner to corner, holding out a small tin cup and hoping for coins. People who had once admired him passed by without a second glance, or if they did recognize him, they looked away, perhaps finding satisfaction in seeing the mighty brought low. Each day, Vincent encountered those he had dismissed, ignored, or mistreated. There was Martha, a waitress from one of his hotels who remembered the day he'd publicly berated her for spilling a drink. She looked at him with a mixture of pity and disdain as she walked by, dropping a few coins into his cup without a word. Then there was Alex, a janitor who used to clean the floors of his office building. When Alex recognized him, he paused, shook his head with a sad smile, and walked away without offering help. Months passed, and Vincent learned to survive on the streets, relying on shelters and soup kitchens. He no longer cared about the scornful looks or whispers. His pride, once so towering, had been shattered, and in its place was a deep loneliness he had never known. He spent his days reflecting on the choices that had led him here, realizing the harm he had caused in his blind pursuit of wealth and power. Regret gnawed at him, a constant reminder of the emptiness he'd created in his life. One rainy evening, as Vincent sat under the shelter of a shop awning, a young woman approached him. She handed him a sandwich and a cup of coffee, offering a warm smile. She introduced herself as Clara, a social worker who had held his story through the city's whispers. Instead of judgment, Clara showed Vincent compassion, listening as he recounted his journey, the highs and the lows. For the first time, someone saw Vincent not as a businessman, nor as a failure, but simply as a person. With Clara's help, Vincent found his way into a local program that helped the homeless find work and housing. The path was slow, but with each small step, Vincent began to rebuild his life, not in wealth, but in purpose. He volunteered at shelters, worked odd jobs, and eventually found steady employment as a mentor for young men and women struggling with pride and ambition, helping them avoid the mistakes he'd made. Years later, Vincent still lived modestly, his days of wealth and power long behind him. He walked the streets of Marigold as a changed man, humble and grateful for each day. The city that had once been a backdrop for his vanity had become his home in a new way, a place where he'd found not only redemption but also a chance to rebuild, this time, with humility, respect, and compassion.